For nearly 90 years, Greyhound buses have operated across the country, and in many remote communities, a Greyhound has been the only reliable way in and out of town. This week, though, the company announced it's cancelling all passenger and freight routes in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and all but one route in BC. Many communities are expressing shock and disappointment, worried this will affect the country's most vulnerable. Greyhound says a steep decline in ridership is to blame for the move. So now what? Should the federal government intervene? Joining me now from Vancouver is Greyhound's Regional Vice President for Western Canada, Peter Hamill. Hi, Mr. Hamill. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, good afternoon.
So yesterday, Senior Vice President Stuart Kendrick urged Canadians to talk to their local politicians about the need for this service and a long-term plan. What does your company want the government to do?
Well, I think this is a message that Greyhound has been communicating for the last year, for the last 5 years. Greyhound has in mind a funding model called the Connecting Community Fund, which had some success in the United States, which is similar to the 5311F funding model in the United States.
So sorry, in layman's terms, what does that mean? That you were hoping for, that you had been talking or asking the federal government for subsidization for those routes?
The conversation is based around the money that's allocated by the federal government to the provinces. Greyhound has made it clear on numerous occasions and over a long period of time that no private sector company would be sustainable in any of these regions without some sort of assistance. The connecting funding model allows the rural communities the accessibility to the funding that comes from the federal government to the province.
So were those conversations with the federal government or with provinces out west, or both?
The conversation starts with the federal government, then that is communicated down to the provincial levels, and we've been in constant communication over the last 3 to 5 years in regards to this type of Connecting Community Fund.
So constant communication with the federal government, what does that mean?
Constant communication through our government relations department, any time that in advance of any type of route elimination, any type of frequency reductions, we continue to tell the story about the funding model that's required for private sector companies. I want to be clear, though, that this isn't a funding model or any type of subsidy or handout just to Greyhound. This is something that is a funding model that should be accessible to the rural communities who don't necessarily have the voice or the strength to demand the funds that you're seeing allocated to the provinces.
And so what was the answer that you received? Just a flat out no every time you brought it up?
Well, it wasn't the answer that we certainly expected. We appreciate that they listened to the story. We had given the example of the 5311F funding model in the United States, where that the overall pot has a portion allocated to the rural communities. That's somewhat different in Canada, where the overall pot isn't specifically allocated to the rural communities who would have access to that and can maintain service in their communities.
If you had received that money, or if that plan that you described had actually come into effect, would that have completely could you then have avoided completely these cancellations? Well,
it's hard to speculate on that. It certainly would have had a better chance to have been successful. We were not asking for a full funding or any type of assistance to 100%. We were looking for a gap funding assistance, which would have been the difference between the money that we make and the money it costs us to operate this. So the gap funding is far less than any type of other subsidy where a new carrier comes in.
What kind of money are we talking about? What is the gap funding? Can you quantify it?
Well, I can't give an exact number here. In the province of Manitoba, there was a service maintenance agreement that had a $2.5 million amount per year that maintained service through the entire province of Manitoba for 2.5 years.
But you can't say whether that, if that had been expanded to all the provinces out west, that would have prevented the announcement yesterday. You can't say for sure.
I can't say for sure that would have been, it certainly would have allowed the conversations to grow. And again, this was not a conversation that this was a specific entity for Greyhound. This is a funding model that is open to everybody, to every private sector company that would look to take on this type of a venture.
At the same time, while those conversations were ongoing, Greyhound had gradually been reducing service and cutting routes since 2009. Do you think that hurt ridership and reduced the company's viability as a transportation option? And do you look back on the strategy now and think that maybe something could have been done differently?
No, I think that without those type of drastic measures taken in advance, that this probably would have been coming sooner. The reason to cut a run at some time is not because we want to see the ridership go down. The reason to cut a run is because the ridership has gone down. And in some of these corridors, the feed and flow, you were looking at the high drain type of corridors that are significant miles with limited ridership, and with the hope to eliminate those to have a better bottom line.
The government released a statement to us on this and Transport Canada. In it says, in 2010, a task force of the provinces and federal government recommended that there was no need for a national program to subsidize the operation of intercity bus carriers. What do you think about that reasoning, I guess?
Well, they certainly have their opinion on that. That doesn't, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think that our argument is that without some sort of assistance on a national level, that there's no way that this type of transportation, based on the economic environment, based on how transportation has changed, I don't see that necessarily, those comments necessarily hold up today. Is
this decision to cancel these routes a forever decision, or if the federal government were to intervene now, is there any chance that the decision could be reversed?
No, this is a decision that is going to be taking effect on October 31st. Even if there was some organization or entity that came up with money within a certain province for that, this is a national issue. This isn't just a specific regional issue, and unless this problem is solved on a national level, it makes no sense to just have pockets in operation.
So unless that's what I'm saying. Unless the federal government intervenes, if they do intervene, though, could the decision be reversed?
Well, I can't speak to what the federal government might do. This is certainly something that we would have a discussion. We would take into consideration, but as it stands now, the province of Manitoba has said that there would be no subsidy. The province of Saskatchewan has shown that they no longer would have a subsidy, and you've seen the demise of STC. BC Transit has come forward and has said that they will not be providing money to the private sector company. In fact, they're reaching out to private sector companies in advance of Greyhound exiting the market on October 31st.
And I have to ask you finally, we just received a statement from the Native Women's Association of Canada saying that they're deeply concerned for the safety of Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people following this announcement. They're also calling on the federal government to intervene. How much did those considerations weigh on your decision?
Those were significant considerations. Greyhound has been at an operating deficit since 2004. We fully have empathy in regards to this type of situation, and it's tragic what's happened specifically on the Highway of Tears. Greyhound at one time had operated 2 schedules along that service, none of which was utilized, and we had to make the difficult decisions that we know impacted the community and we know that impacted the Indigenous communities.
Was that part of your appeal to the federal government, though?
It's certainly part of the conversation.
But have you brought it up? Did Greyhound bring that specific area of concern up to the federal government?
Yes, we did. We brought up all the concerns in regards to the rural communities represented by the Indigenous societies, Indigenous communities. So that's always part of the conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Hamill. Really appreciate your time.
No, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
We reached out to the federal government on this story. Indigenous Services Canada told us they're analyzing the situation and looking for solutions specifically for medical transportation. We're waiting for a response from other departments, and we'll keep you updated.